On this channel, we've spent a lot of time talking about the Titanic, and it's no coincidence, because Titanic is a really good way of teaching maritime history. It's been studied intensively for decades by qualified historians, naval architects, and everyone in between. But the truth is, for everything we know about Titanic, there's still a few things that stand out as unknowns, mysteries, what-ifs. We don't know everything about the ship, and we probably never will. Titanic can teach us a lot, but sometimes the hypotheticals, the questions that she leaves behind, are just as valuable a teaching tool as the facts that we know. Some of my favourite videos on this channel have explored the mysteries that Titanic has left us to this day. So today we thought it would be fun to revisit some of these videos and present them in one presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are some of the enduring mysteries of the Titanic. On the morning of April 15th, 1912, at around 2:15 AM, the end had come for RMS Titanic. As passengers and crew struggled around the base of the number 1 funnel to free and fill the lifeboats there, the ship took a dive down by the head and a wave washed up the boat deck. Suddenly, the desperate crowd was presented with a fresh misery. The forward funnel, the height of a 5-story building, came crashing down on their heads. Today, we're all familiar with the sight of Titanic's funnels. The 4 black and buff-coloured smokestacks have become something of an icon synonymous with the great ship itself. But what were they made of? How did they work, and why did they collapse as the ship sank? Other ships of the time sank, like Lusitania, and their funnels stayed in place until they hit the sea floor. What was it about Titanic's that made them come down? Today, we'll analyse the funnels, how they were made, how they worked, and the forces at play that caused them to fall. To understand why Titanic had 4 funnels at all, and why they were so big, we need to delve a little bit into the history behind these things. And don't worry, I promise you, it's an interesting story. In the early days of steam, ships carried 1 or 2 small boilers to generate the steam, so only a single chimney-styled smokestack was required. But then, as vessels grew in size and complexity, the number of horsepower required to move each ship increased, and so did the number of boilers. The earliest steamships had 1 or maybe 2 funnels, but in 1859, a new ship set to sea with no fewer than 5 of the things. There was a good reason for this. The SS Great Eastern was ridiculously big. In 1857, the biggest ship in the world was a steamer called Adriatic, which was about 354 feet, or 108 meters long, and 3,670 gross registered tons. And then a year later, Great Eastern was launched at 692 feet, that's 211 meters long, and 18,915 gross registered tons. Now that is a ridiculous jump in size. The ship was the brainchild of the revolutionary engineer Isambard Brunel, a legend and industrialist, and his ship, which he nicknamed his Great Babe, was an absolute outlier. Moving a ship that large through the water needed a similarly immense amount of horsepower. She was fitted with 4 steam engines for the paddles, and another for her propeller, giving her an impressive speed of 14 knots. That's 26 kilometers per hour, or 16 miles per hour. It was more than just impressive engineering for the time. It was achieved by supplying Great Eastern's engines with a monumental amount of coal and boilers to burn it and make the steam. The result was a then unheard of amount of 10 massive boilers producing both the required steam and a heap of thick, black, acrid coal smoke. Now, venting this up and out of the ship was the job of the funnels, and the larger number of boilers simply meant there needed to be more funnels to deal with the smoke. The 10 boilers were each paired to a funnel, resulting in the impressive array of 5 thin smokestacks, each one tall enough to ensure the worst of the smoke would pass harmlessly over passengers' heads on deck. Now, this ship is nothing short of an engineering marvel, but at the time, Great Eastern was actually mocked for its then ridiculous size and also for the number of funnels that it carried. It was just 50 or 60 years ahead of its time, and Brunel would have the last laugh because decades later, in the 1890s, German shipbuilders used essentially the same layout to create the blueprint for the world's first 4-funneled liner, the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, Now, obviously this was to do with the number of boilers and the speed that the ship needed to hit, but it caused a sensation with its 4 huge smokestacks, and carrying that many funnels became de rigueur for the most prestigious passenger ships on the Atlantic. Cunard Line were quick to follow up a few years later with their own pair of 4-funnelled superliners, Lusitania and Mauritania, and then it was White Star Line's turn. Now we understand why Titanic had 4 funnels. It was clearly to do with the arrangement and the layout of the boilers. The first 3 funnels were coupled to boilers and dealt with the smoke and fumes, but there's actually been a bit of a myth surrounding the 4th funnel, that it was just a dummy, only added for looks. If we cut Titanic down the middle, you can see that the 4th funnel really does sit over a part of the ship dense with machinery, the turbine engine room. Other ships of the day, like Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, provided deep shafts to ventilate the engine rooms and provide an exit for warm air. Titanic had one just like it over her main engine room too. But there was a peculiarity in Titanic's design that made her different to other ships. She had a 3rd engine, a steam turbine that was different to her main engines. It needed its own ventilation as well. Now, White Star could have just installed another shaft or a dense pack of ventilators designed to draw in fresh air, but obviously that wouldn't work with the ship's balance, so the inclusion of a funnel as a ventilator here was, in that sense, for aesthetics. But the 4th funnel also vented smoke from 2 different key areas. The fireplace and the first-class smoking room here, but more crucially the massive galleys for the various dining saloons. That smoke from the ovens too needed to be lifted high over the heads of passengers, and the 4th funnel did the job. We'll have a closer look at how they did so shortly, but that was a brief explanation of how and why Titanic got her 4 funnels. Now, funnels also performed a secondary job of marketing their owners. A ship's funnels are arguably the vessel's most identifiable feature, and this was especially true in Titanic's era, when they were proudly painted in their company's colours. Now, it was an easy marketing opportunity, and paint schemes of all sorts were applied to make the company's fleet stand out. But even this idea was a relatively new one. Smokestacks hadn't even really been around that long because steamships had only become widespread some 50 or 60 years earlier in the mid-1800s. Early on, the stacks were usually painted black to hide the soot from all the thick coal smoke that was spewing out of them, but then something changed. One of the early steamship adopters was the famous Cunard Line, and their bright vermilion funnels and black bands soon became an icon of the transatlantic trade. Funnels, as we'll soon explore in more detail, are extremely hot, and they're made of very thin metal, so they need to be protected against corrosion and damage. In the early days of the steamship, engineer Robert Napier was grappling with the issue of painting a funnel. Regular paint would flake right off because of the heat. He patented a special mixture of buttermilk and red ochre, a weird mix that actually worked brilliantly because the heat of the funnel would then self-bake the concoction on and therefore make it stronger and more resilient. It resulted in a bright orange-red colour that soon was passed on to his business partner, a man named Samuel Cunard, who adopted it for his ships. The colour soon became known as Cunard Red, and the concept of brand recognition through the steamship's funnel colours was cemented. The idea took off as more and more steamship companies were founded and wanted to identify their ships from the pack. Cunard Line's great rival, the White Star Line, adopted their own recognisable colour scheme, a colour known as White Star Buff that was somewhere between a warm yellow and a light tan brown, with a black top for the soot. Titanic carried those 4 immense funnels, each painted in the immediately recognisable White Star Buff paint scheme. So now we know the history behind why Titanic had so many funnels and why they looked the way they did. We need to deep dive into some engineering behind their function because this gives us some clues as to why they might have failed on the night of the sinking. Well, it turns out that Titanic's funnels, as viewed from the outside, were, if you'll forgive the pun, just the tip of the iceberg. The entire structure was complex and ran deep into the bowels of the ship. We'll start down here in the boiler rooms, where coal is burnt to boil water and generate huge amounts of steam. The steam is vented under pressure into the engines, but the excess smoke from the burning coal has nowhere to go. We already knew that. The Titanic's funnels served to vent the gases and the smoke, but they also helped the boilers burn hotter in the first place and more efficiently, purely because of their massive size. Now, we've covered this already in more detail in our video outlining the workings of Titanic's engines, but essentially, a fire needs oxygen to burn well, and getting oxygen into the bottom of a ship 10 stories below the upper deck is something of a challenge. Titanic used large fans called stokehold fans to suck in gallons of air from above and feed it directly into the boiler rooms themselves. They didn't feed the fires in the boilers directly. Instead, the boiler furnaces would draw the air in around them, meaning the fresh air also helped to keep the room itself and the poor workers somewhat cool. Temperatures could still reach the high 40s in Celsius. That's between 110 and 120 Fahrenheit, but it was better than nothing. The fire in the boilers needed a draft to help suck in the fresh air and burn hotter, and this is where the funnels came in. It was actually all a simple mathematical equation. That many furnaces, and Titanic had 159 of them, needed a certain amount of oxygen for the most efficient burn, and this dictated the size of the funnel's internal flue. It worked just like the chimney of a house, but on an enormous scale. The internal flue size was guided by the amount of area that was needed to provide the optimum draft for burning in the furnaces. It's why old steamships' funnels were so big and tall. In fact, some were ridiculously so, like the poor old USS Helena here of 1897. So now we know the boilers are burning the coal and being fed a lot of fresh air, but all that soot and smoke generated from the furnaces has to go somewhere, and this is where the uptakes come in. Boiler uptakes were elaborate, branched structures made up of thin, riveted steel plates. Each branch connected to a boiler's smoke box and received the soot, the smoke, and the gases directly from the boiler's furnaces. A complex system of internal baffle plates channeled the smoke by creating a draft and ensuring it was heading with force in the same direction at all times. The uptakes, and it cannot be stressed enough, were huge, and so was the amount of smoke pouring through them. As such, a huge chimney was needed to vent this well out of the ship, and here is where the first funnel structure actually comes into play, the lower funnel, spanning the top of the uptakes to the top of the boiler casings. Now the lower funnels were fairly complex in their own right, but suffice it to say they acted as a flue, and were split on the inside into sections to ensure optimum draft, even if one of the connected boiler rooms was non-operational at the time. The lower funnels would have been extremely hot to the touch. The gases being vented through them reached about 315 degrees Celsius or 599 degrees Fahrenheit, so they were encased for their entire height by boiler casings, which shielded the public spaces from all that heat. This is why the interiors of Titanic featured the occasional odd rectangular structure right in the middle of large public rooms. They were well decorated, so you probably wouldn't really notice them, but they were really the boiler casings which housed the uptakes and the lower funnel, like this one down here on D-deck in the first class dining saloon and reception room, and this one here from the first class smoking room. Inside the casings, insulation like cotton silicate or cork slabs between 1.5 to 2 inches thick, that's about 5 centimeters, provided some insulation against the great heat. The lower funnels rose to the height of the boat deck houses at the top of the ship, and connected to this structure is the one we all know and love, the upper funnel, each some 60 odd feet tall. In fact, to account for the ship's shear, that is, the amount that it sagged in the middle, each funnel was a different height, the two tallest being numbers 2 and 3, so that from afar they would all look to actually be the same height. The funnels were actually deceptively complex in their internal layout, while also being extremely fragile in their construction. In the early days of steam, funnels had basically just been large chimneys that vented the smoke out and were extremely hot to the touch. Remember Napier's paint formula that actually baked itself onto the steel? Well, by Titanic's day, things had changed somewhat. To prevent burns, the funnel was made to be a double-walled structure made of riveted metal plates. Putting some distance between the inner and outer walls would mean the hot gases inside wouldn't heat the outside up as much as it might otherwise. The funnels were built as one piece in the Harland & Wolff shops, winched up onto massive cars, and then trundled out to Titanic as she waited at the fitting out wharf. They were craned up one by one, and then riveted to the ship's deck plates. We'll get to that in a minute. The inner structure was connected directly to the lower funnel, and took in the gases being vented from them and the uptakes. It was spaced apart from the outer structure by metal plates to ensure that the exterior of the funnel would not run as hot, and then to make sure the funnels retained their shape, they were reinforced with bands and stiffening rods at their tops to keep their elliptical cross-section. The funnels were made to be as lightweight but strong as possible. The ship was expected to rock and roll all over the place in bad weather, and those funnels would have to hold on for dear life. If they were built too heavy or over-engineered, no amount of bracing wires or reinforcement would hold them in place because they were each the height of a 5-story building. The steel plating used to make them was fairly robust, up to a ½ inch thick, that's about 13 millimeters, but when you consider the thing was as tall as an apartment block, you realise they actually weren't too heavy duty at all. In fact, this unique footage shows the Cunard liner Berengaria of Titanic's vintage being scrapped in the 1930s, and watch what happens when the funnels lose their support wires and are brought down on the deck. The internal bracing and stiffening rods which have held them in shape for 2 decades are overcome, and the funnel flattens out like a pancake. Now, being this delicate and also being extremely tall, the funnels needed some good support to stay mounted to the constantly pitching and rolling ship, which was no easy task. Just imagine the amount of strain they'd be under in a storm. The funnels were connected to the ship's decks by 2 means. First, the very bottom of the upper funnel structure featured a flange, which was riveted directly to the deck plates. But this alone wouldn't hold the funnels in place. They needed to be supported all around to keep them upright. Now this was the job of the stays and shrouds, galvanized steel wire rope 1¼ inch or 3.17 centimeters thick, connected to the funnel's tops with shackles along one of those stiffening bands designed to help maintain the funnel's shape. We mentioned earlier that the funnels were double-walled to prevent excess heat, but despite this, believe it or not, when under steam, the funnels would actually lengthen because of how hot it was. There had to be allowance for the strain. Now because of this, the shrouds or cables couldn't be connected directly to the deck because they might snap under the pressure as the funnels became increasingly taller, even if only by inches or mere centimeters. To help with this, thick hemp rope, a lanyard, was woven around the shroud cables, and that was attached to pad eyes or shackles on the deck. This way the tension could actually be controlled. In fact, before lighting the boilers on departure, the funnel's shrouds would be actually slackened off by the crews at their lanyard so that the funnels could increase in size and the strain would be eased. The funnels were also a convenient place to mount other important pieces of equipment. Naturally, the ship's huge sets of whistles sat proudly on a platform towards the funnel's tops. Each funnel actually had its own set of these tri-bell type steam whistles, but only the forward 2 sets actually functioned. Forward and abaft or behind the funnels were mounted tall waste steam pipes which could be used to vent excess steam out of the boilers if the engines were stopped or if too much steam was being generated. Because the funnels provided a nice, tall surface, various water pipes could be fitted to them too. You can see them in photos. The U-shaped piping runs up about half the height. This means that the water system for the ship's taps was provided with a natural pressure from the gravity afforded by mounting the pipes to the tall funnels. So now we well know what Titanic's funnels were made out of, how they functioned, and how they were attached to the ship. But on the night of the sinking, something very strange happened. Those carefully engineered structures came crashing dramatically down. Something had gone horribly wrong. At about 2:15 AM, all hell had broken loose on the roof of the officers' quarters underneath the ship's first funnel. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was working with a group of sailors to prepare an Engelhardt collapsible lifeboat for lowering when the ship sank out from underneath his feet with an alarming plunge. It sent a wave rolling up the boat deck, knocking people over and sucking Lightoller down, pinning him up against a ventilator's grating as water rushed in to fill the empty void below. Lightoller was eventually blasted off by a rush of hot air and came to the surface near the collapsible boat that he'd tried to help free. It had floated clean off the deck as the ship sank. He explained himself what happened next at the inquiry when he said, "I just held onto something, a piece of rope or something, and was there for a little while, and then the forward funnel fell down. It fell within 3 or 4 inches of the boat. It lifted the boat bodily and threw her about 20 feet clear of the ship, as near as I could judge." Now that was an incredible near miss, and extremely fortunate for those who were clinging onto the boat for dear life, but others were not so lucky. Dick Norris Williams was a rising tennis star travelling with his father in first class. They were both swept into the water by the downwards plunge too, and Richard caught sight of his father swimming towards him. He later wrote, "I saw one of the 4 great funnels come crashing down on top of him. Just for one instant I stood there transfixed, not because it had only missed me by a few feet. Curiously enough, not because it had killed my father, for whom I had a far more than normal feeling of love and attachment, but there I was transfixed, wondering at the enormous size of this funnel, still belching smoke. It seemed to me that two cars could have been driven through it side by side. As the funnels came down, we can assume they flattened out now that the bracing was overcome, just as we saw in that footage of Berengaria's scrapping. Even worse was to come though. With the funnels down and detached from their seatings on the deck, a gaping maw was left behind, where, according to passenger Eugene Daly, people were sucked in by a torrent of water like flies. It's very grim stuff. As if the ship's sinking wasn't already bad enough, the collapsing funnels, and by the way, number 2 went down soon after number 1 did in a shower of sparks and soot, took quite a few people with them. So what had happened? These funnels were designed to weather the worst of the Atlantic storms, the heavy pitching and rolling in huge seas. They were lightly built, heavily braced and reinforced, but still they had failed. Lightoller presented his own theory at the inquiries when he said, "The terrific strain of bringing the after end of that huge hull clear out of the water caused the expansion joint abaft number 1 funnel to open up. The fact that the 2 wire stays to this funnel on the after part led over and abaft the expansion joint threw on them an extraordinary strain, eventually carrying away the port wire guy to be followed almost immediately by the starboard one. Instantly the port one parted, the funnel started to fall, but the fact that the starboard one held on a moment or two longer gave this huge structure a pull to that side of the ship." Titanic had 2 big expansion joints for her upper decks. Bridges actually use these today for similar reasons. Essentially, large structures tend to bend and sag, or lengthen and shorten depending on conditions. For a ship like Titanic, her hull was designed to hog and sag to some extent over big waves. If built too stiffly, it would simply break apart in a heavy sea because there was no easing of the strain. The superstructure on top of Titanic wasn't part of the hull, it was simply attached and would be expected to bend and sag along with it. To help it do this without tearing any of the steel plating that made it up, expansion joints were fitted, breaks in the structure that were separated by a short distance. In passenger spaces, the joint was covered with brass and leather to hide it, or at least make it barely noticeable, but with the expansion joints fitted, the superstructure could now flex with the ship's hull. And as Lightoller noted, the immense strain of the sinking was causing Titanic's hull and superstructure atop it to hog. That is, bend downwards, thanks to the effects of gravity pushing the stern down as it was rising higher through the sinking. With the expansion joints opened up, the stays or support cables which supported the after part of the funnel were on the other side of the expansion joint, and his theory suggests that they were suddenly under huge strain and that they failed. But the question has to be asked though, was the parting of those stays the cause of the collapse, or just a symptom? See, Titanic's funnel stays and shrouds were designed to withstand a huge amount of pressure. On the transatlantic run, heavy seas and rolling waves could cause a ship to roll and list either 10, 15, or 20 degrees or more. Now, this type of experience was commonplace, and ship design had to take it into account. It's worth remembering that Olympic, throughout her entire career, in rough seas and storms, never lost a funnel. And it's hard to imagine that Harland and Wolff designed the funnels such that the parting of 1 or 2 stays could ever possibly cause a collapse in the first place. In fact, the last 2 funnels on Titanic remained in place high up in the air. Funnel number 3 had a pair of stays that crossed over an after expansion joint as well, but that funnel remained in place until the ship broke apart underneath it. It shed some doubt on Lightoller's theory. If it was just the effects of gravity and the opened expansion joints at play, shouldn't all 4 funnels have come down at the same time? Well, the timing of the funnel's collapse actually gives us our first major clue as to what was actually happening. Funnel number 1 collapsed when water, roaring up the boat deck, met its base, and then number 2 did the same thing. Clearly, the water was having some effect, but what? At the British inquiry into the disaster, naval architect Edward Wilding, who'd actually helped design the ship, gave his opinion when he said, "The funnels are carried from the casings in the way of the comparatively light upper decks, that is the boat and the A deck. When these decks became submerged and the water got inside those houses, the water would rise outside much faster than inside, and the excessive pressure on the comparatively light casings, which are not made to take a pressure of that kind, would cause the casing to collapse, would take the seating out from under the funnel and bring the funnel down." Now, water pressure is capable of terrifying things, as anybody familiar with the effects of delta P can testify. 1 foot of water pressure equates to roughly 3.06 kilopascals, or less than half a pound per square inch. But as water rushed up the funnel's base as the bow sank, the pressure increased dramatically. At 10 feet, the funnel's base would have been under some 30.6 kilopascals, or 4.4 psi of pressure, and the casings and deckhouses down on A deck would now be under 92 kilopascals, or 13 psi of pressure. Now, what Wilding was suggesting was that the lower funnels and the casings were buckled by the water pressure, and this brought the funnel down too. But the evidence from the wreck suggests otherwise, because the casings and the lower funnel are still all there in fine shape. It seems more likely that water rushing up the boat deck surged around the base of number 1 funnel, and then the pressure began to mount. We know the funnel collapsed sometime after light oil surfaced nearby, meaning that the funnel would have had to have sunk for a while, and its base would have been at quite a depth when it came down. Perhaps it was as deep as 20 feet or 6 meters. With the entire interior of that funnel, the lower funnel and the casings not yet flooded and now under extreme pressures, a structural failure would have been inescapable. It's not implausible to think that water pressure began to buckle the base of Titanic's forward funnels, because at 25 feet of depth, the funnel's base would have been under around 11 psi, or 74.5 kilopascals. As the base buckled and the funnel began to topple, excess pressure on the shrouds and the stays would have caused them to snap. To those in the water outside, like Lightoller, it might have looked as if the shrouds and the stays were straining and snapping, causing the funnel to fall, but it was actually the other way around. 11 psi doesn't sound like a lot, but acting on something as big, hollow, and lightly built as Titanic's funnels, it seems likely that the ocean's pressure at that depth could have brought them down. We know the water pressure was enough to collapse the grand staircase dome covered directly behind the number 1 funnel almost as soon as it was immersed in water, for example. Today on the wreck, there's no structure there at all, just an open hole where it once sat. Another clue to the water pressure hypothesis is the fate of funnels 3 and 4, which remained attached comfortably, high and dry, despite that ridiculous 20 to 30 degree angle down and the same list to the side that the forward funnels had endured. These funnels only detached during the breakup, when the forces of gravity became simply far too much for the structures to endure. Other ships from Titanic's era sank with surprising results. In 1916, Titanic's sister ship Britannic sank after striking a mine off Kea in Greece, and the result was very similar. Like Titanic, her funnels seemed to collapse one by one in turn, with survivor Corporal J. Waugh stating that as each funnel touched the water, it was torn off just like paper. Curiously though, just a year prior, the liner RMS Lusitania had sunk too, but her funnels remained attached as they were pulled underwater. Surely they must have been under similar forces as Titanic and Britannic's. Well, even though she was some 10,000 tons smaller than Titanic, Lusitania's funnels were even taller. But interestingly, they were actually braced with double sets of shrouds and stays at 2 different levels compared to Titanic's 1. If the bases of Lusitania's funnels began to crumple and fail, it could be that the much greater number of support cables was able to take up the strain and keep them in place. On top of that, differences in the makeup of the funnels, the plating thickness, the amount of stiffeners and internal reinforcement, it all might have meant that Titanic and Britannic's funnel designs were just more susceptible to failing and collapsing once subjected to water pressures than Lusitania's ever were. That's not a fault on the part of the designers though. No ship's funnel would ever need to endure that kind of punishment in normal life. Titanic's funnels are an incredibly iconic part of the ship's exterior, so much so that just the sight of any 4-funneled ship will invariably bring up the story of Titanic. Show your regular person a photograph of Aquitania, and chances are they'll call it Titanic. The number and size of a ship's funnels rose to symbolize that vessel's size and power, but in time they fell out of favor, possibly thanks to the Titanic disaster in part, but mostly due to changing tastes. In the 1920s, ships' funnels became smaller and more streamlined. There's just something so Victorian and industrial about the tall, straight funnels of Titanic's day, almost exactly like a factory chimney. As Art Deco took hold, ships' funnels shrank in size and became more shapely thanks to liners like Germany's Bremen and the USA's SS America. Today, ships still have funnels, but they're almost more of an afterthought. Ships aren't packed with dozens of boilers anymore, only diesel engines, meaning a single funnel is usually enough to do the job. Few could be considered iconic, save maybe for that of the Queen Mary 2, whose funnel shape was designed specifically to be short enough to fit under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in New York, while featuring a large wind scoop to make sure that the smoke lifts high over the heads of the ship's passengers. I shot this footage myself last year, and I can tell you from experience that it definitely works. In a fitting touch, the funnel of this ship, the last and the largest ocean liner ever built, is finished in a variation of Cunard red, the same colour that Napier had developed all the way back in the early 1800s. Today on the wreck of Titanic, there is very little sign of those once proud and towering funnels. They broke free of the ship, but their shrouds and stays remained attached, causing havoc as they ripped up and down the deck, those 1¼ inch, 3.17 centimetre thick cables tearing lifeboat davits and equipment clean off the decks. The funnels themselves likely flattened out as they hit the water, like we saw with Berengaria's. Now, there only remains are some nearly unrecognisable piles of tangled plating and pipes on the ocean floor. It's hard to believe these majestic things once towered high over the ocean in the days when Titanic was the newest, finest ship in the world. In 1985, a team of researchers was absolutely glued to their screens because they were seeing something remarkable. They'd just rediscovered the wreck of Titanic, lost for over 7 decades at the bottom of the North Atlantic. Their cameras found the bow of the ship beautifully intact, sitting incredibly upright on the sea floor after a 12,500 foot, nearly 4,000 kilometre drop straight down, and they swept along the hull, which rose up like a cliff face from the ocean floor. But then it just kind of, stopped. There came a sudden realisation. The passenger reports that the ship had broken apart during the sinking were actually true. Now, we've done a video covering the breakup before. More passengers said the ship broke up than those that didn't. But it was still a stunning revelation. It meant the stern section was still somewhere out there, just waiting to be found. Amazingly, it was discovered resting some 2,600 feet, nearly 800 meters away. And oh boy, what a mess. The stern section was in a shocking state of destruction, and expedition members were awed by the level of damage. It looked, many have said since, as if a giant bomb had gone off. What happened to Titanic's stern? Why is the ship in 2 pieces? One beautifully frozen in time, the other a shattered, empty husk. All kinds of theories have been put forward, from implosion to even the idea of the devastating explosion of goods stored on board. This wreck footage from RMS Titanic Inc. gives us a remarkable view of Titanic as she sits on the sea floor. Particularly interesting is all this damage to the stern. Up close, it can very often be hard to tell what you're even looking at. It looks like bent and folded cardboard, but this is steel plating an inch thick in some places. There are popped rivets in their thousands, twisted frames made of solid steel. What on earth happened here? Well, Dr. Robert Ballard and the research team back in 1985 asked themselves the exact same question. Now, viewing things up close like this, it's really difficult to get a picture of what the whole stern section actually even looks like. Now, back then, there weren't any fancy side scans, sonar imagery, or the techniques like we have today. The stern had to be recreated the old-fashioned way, by hand, and fortunately, they had just the man to do it. Artist Ken Marshall was called in to refer to the hundreds of tiny photos of the stern section and to paint what it might look down there in its entirety. The results were shocking. His paintings of the wreck have been published in books and magazines around the world. Arguably, it's his painting of the stern section which captures the imagination the most. So what happened to the ship to cause all of this? Well, to begin with, we need to wind the clock back to the early hours of April 15th, 1912, when the Titanic was in her final death throes. The ship's bow had sunk far below the ocean's surface, and the stern was rising higher and higher into the air. With the lights still burning, although dimmed, as the ship's machinery struggled to work under the onerous conditions, the ship's 3 bronze propellers and about 25,000 tons of stern section towered above the heads of survivors, and then, with a snap, the lights went out, and the ship began to tear itself apart, breaking around the region of the 3rd funnel. We looked closely at this and other ships which have broken apart in another video, and concluded that the breakup would probably have been quite clean, not unlike that of the RMS Magdalena here. And what happened next is up for some debate. Whether the stern was pulled down or sank under the massive weight of its own engines, more than 1,300 tons of iron and steel at the very forward exposed end of the breakup zone. Either way, survivors watched on as the stern pulled back up to the near vertical and then slipped beneath the waves. Somewhere along the way, from the surface of the ocean to the sea floor 12,500 feet down, Titanic's stern was horribly, horribly disfigured. So what happened? Well, there's a few things we need to consider. The first explanation often offered for this is one that has been very much more on the public radar since June 2023. And that is the theory of an implosion. Now, the theory that Titanic's stern imploded violently can trace its origins back to director and underwater explorer James Cameron. Now, we all know him as the driving force behind the 1997 film, but Cameron also has some serious underwater chops, having dived the wreck many times and seen the damage and destruction up close and personal. Through the years, he's analysed his findings and the footage captured from the wreck to piece together the puzzle of the ship's final moments, and these have been presented many times in documentaries for National Geographic and others. In 2012, it was time for Cameron to do it for the last time, putting together a team of experts to analyse the wreck to find out what had happened. In the animation they put together, they show Titanic's stern slip beneath the waves before, boom, it implodes, causing massive damage. The theory is that Titanic's stern section, unlike the bow, flooded and sank in a very, very short amount of time at the end there. It meant that there was air still left trapped inside, and that once the stern had sunk down to 200 or 300 feet, the water pressure caused the stern structure to fail along the hull, resulting in an enormous boom that blasted it apart. The only issue is this is highly unlikely to have actually happened. But before we go into why, we need to understand what an implosion actually is. It sounds self-explanatory, but there's actually a few physics things in there that really convolute things. First, we all understand the concept of water pressure, that the deeper down you go, the more pressure there is. You can think of it simply as the weight of water. The deeper down you go, the more water there is simply above you pressing down. It's a linear scale. That is, the water pressure increases at the same rate with depth, about one of Earth's atmospheres for every 10 meters or 33 feet. It means that at the bottom of some of the deepest parts of the ocean, the pressure can exceed 1,000 atmospheres. Now, this is equivalent to the weight of 2 SUV cars pressing down on every square inch of your body. Ouch. Now, what these kinds of pressures can do to man-made structures was dramatically and tragically demonstrated in mid-2023 when the submersible Titan catastrophically failed above the wreck of the Titanic. Now, this was caused most likely by the failure of the carbon fiber pressure hull of the submersible, thanks to a little thing called pressure differential. Now, this is a state where there's significant difference between the pressure outside of a hollow object versus inside that object. Essentially, the greater pressure outside will act to push the hollow structure in on itself, crushing it like you might crush a tin can in your hands. Now, for a structure to experience a pressure differential great enough to cause an implosion, it needs to be like the submersible Titan, watertight, obviously, but also airtight. If there's no way for the air to get out and the water to get in, then the pressure builds alarmingly. Eventually, there comes a breaking point, and a critical failure occurs. The structure blasts inwards on itself, the air inside being completely compressed rapidly, briefly hitting massive temperatures. Now, the reason air heats as it compresses is because the molecules are forced closer together and bounce off one another like little rubber balls, faster and faster, all the while with more energy. This is called adiabatic compression, and it happens all in a fraction of a second, of course. So in short, for conditions to actually cause an implosion on a structure, we need a sealed, airtight container. If the container wasn't watertight or airtight, then it would partially flood inside, but the air above could compress to a point where the pressure differential would equalize. There couldn't be an implosion because the air would be pushing back with the same force as the water pressing in on it. So now we need to apply all this to Titanic. As the ship's stern is pulled underwater, suddenly all the trapped air inside is rushing out with extreme force being replaced inside by the ocean itself. Now, air pockets in ships are a thing. They can form where air becomes trapped, say, in awkward corners or sealed compartments like refrigeration units. Now, does this mean Titanic could have made it hundreds or even thousands of feet down with air pockets still trapped inside? Well, yeah. I mean, it's a pretty scary thought, actually. Some people have survived being in air pockets for days. In May 2013, a chef spent 60 hours in an air pocket about 100 feet below the surface in a sunken ship. Now, Titanic did have refrigerators and some cold insulated storage deep down in her stern section. Now, Cameron and his team would tell us that enough air was trapped in Titanic's stern section that as it passed 200 or 300 feet of depth, it suddenly and catastrophically imploded, similar to the Titan submersible. Except that other ships have sunk at similar speeds to Titanic, but not suffered implosion damage to the scale that ship is supposed to have. For example, the wreck of Lusitania, the ship sank in only 20 or so minutes, and although today it's in a shocking state of disrepair, there's actually no discernible evidence of implosion. The same's true of the sister ship of Titanic, Britannic. She's in remarkable condition. On Lusitania, you'd expect plating and bulkheads to be buckled inward under the extreme outside pressure. Remember that little thing called pressure differential we were talking about? But there's nothing like that, and there's really nothing like that down on Titanic either. Shell plating and bits of the ship have clearly been ripped away, but it doesn't seem like it collapsed in on itself. None of the plating is buckled or pressed inwards. Instead, it's been blasted away. We also have to think about why an implosion would be unlikely because of the way the ship was actually built. Remember, we said we need correct conditions for an implosion, airtight and watertight compartments or pockets within the ship's hull, but Titanic had very, very few true air or watertight spaces. Virtually every compartment within the ship had to be ventilated to allow fresh air in and out, even the refrigeration and storage compartments. Enclosed voids in ships with no ventilation at all are an enormous risk to life. You could easily get overwhelmed by gases or carbon dioxide and die. Designers go out of their way to remove this risk as much as possible with ventilation. Not only that, but Titanic's stern section was made up of dozens and dozens of staterooms and cabins, separated only by timber planked walls, not metal bulkheads, as you'd imagine. There's very little down there that would be able to withstand the forces of water pressure to even build air pockets. Cameron and his team show the stern section acting like a single structure, falling in one go. So we need to look at the stern itself and ask if it meets the conditions of air and water tightness. Well, after being broken apart and ripped apart at one end, it obviously doesn't. There was plenty of opportunity for air to escape en masse as it was forced out by the ocean. One way is the hundreds of portholes along the ship's side. We know from passenger testimonies that Titanic's third-class accommodations were uncomfortably warm on the night of the sinking, and passengers weren't able to control their in-stateroom heat with thermostats like we might today. Now, to account for this, many might have opened their portholes to allow the cool air in. With dozens of portholes possibly open, the air trapped within Titanic's stern could have been pushed out under force as the ship sank. There were other escape routes too. Every stateroom, cabin, and public room was fed fresh air by a complicated system of ducts and trunking, which led down into the ship from up on the top decks. Even the fourth funnel, that was torn off during the sinking, but its stories-deep shaft led right down into the turbine room and opened it up to the sky. There are also 4 cargo hatches on the stern section, each topped only with a relatively flimsy cover that displaced air under pressure from below could easily pop off. Even given the rapid final plunge of the stern section, it's unlikely that large amounts of air were trapped at all because Titanic's stern was not built to be airtight like a submersible like Titan is. Watertight? Sure, but with hundreds and hundreds of avenues for air to escape if under pressure. There's this great little moment right at the end of the 1997 movie where the skylight cover over the steering room at the very stern of the ship explodes out as air is being pushed out of the ship by the water under extreme pressure. But there's even more compelling real-life footage that might show us what Titanic's stern looked like as it went down. In 1991, the Oceanos, a cruise ship and former ocean liner, suffered flooding and she sank. In the final moments, the stern rose vertically and began to slip below, and huge amounts of air and spray erupted from the structure as it went. Right at the end, you can see this cloud of dark dusty air that's like 40 years worth of gathered dust forced out of the ship by the sinking. It's amazing stuff. So, if it wasn't an implosion, what on earth ripped the stern section apart like that? Well, to get an understanding of this, let's take a look at the damage itself to see if there are any clues down there. Along one section of the stern, on the starboard side, the shell plating, the ship's skin, is almost entirely peeled off. The poop deck, the very stern deck, has been peeled up and folded over onto itself like a tin can. Whole sections of the ship's hull around the breakup zone have been torn off, almost intact, and dumped on the ocean floor. The stern section's decks have then collapsed down on one another. Nowadays, the stern's actually no higher than the height of the engines, which were originally deep down in the ship's bowels. An implosion wasn't necessary to achieve this. What we're seeing is most likely a testament to the destructive forces of water itself. Hydrodynamics is a really interesting field of engineering. It explains to us why things like ships and submarines move more efficiently and smoother through the water. A simple kind of reductive explainer tells us that a streamlined object will move smoothly through the water because it doesn't create resistance or drag thanks to its shape. But an object with a large, flat, uneven surface will catch the water as it goes and create lots of drag. Now that puts large force on the structure itself. Titanic's bow, when it sank, was facing the way it was designed to face, forward. It fell forward, it went down through the water to hit the ocean floor, facing forward, and of course it was designed with hydrodynamics in mind, to cut through the ocean like a knife. Simple. It did that when it sank. Now the stern was designed hydrodynamically too, but only if it was heading in the right direction. As the stern section sank down, weighted at its forward end by the 1,300 or so tons of engine, it was going in completely the wrong direction, and opened up to the ocean was a 10-story tall, nearly 100-foot wide, jagged maw of torn and twisted metal, just ideal for creating drag. Now, the scale of these physics is really hard to comprehend. When you take my drawing here of the broken stern section and add a human for scale, you start to understand why. But let's try to imagine what the stern might have gone through as it sank. In the final plunge, water is roaring through the stern at an immensely rapid pace, and the air is being forced out at the same speed. Windows shatter as air surges through. Open portholes roar as all the air inside is being forced out. Inside, the ocean tears through the staterooms and public rooms like an unstoppable tidal wave, a battering ram of boiling white water that shreds everything in its path with devastating force. It leaves the interior of the ship an unrecognizable, empty mess because everything has been flattened by the sheer destructive weight of this almost tsunami of water as it was being swept through. With the air forced out and the interior flattened, the stern begins to drop for the sea floor, but upset in its path because of the weird shape of the breakup. Weakened sections, like the area just behind the third funnel, are torn off in their entirety as the 20,000-ton stern sinks through the water at speeds of somewhere between 10 and 20 knots, spinning as it does. Any structure attached to the stern that's not hydrodynamically streamlined sticks out and creates huge drag. With massive forces then acting on that structure, it simply breaks off. The stern probably twisted as it sank down, exerting forces all over. Exposed shell plating is being ripped and torn off like an old band-aid. Deck houses are flattened, the decks themselves pancake down, and to top it all off, the stern, itself larger in tonnage than the Oceanliner RMS Seadric and longer than the SS Adriatic of 1857, slams into the sea floor with such awful force that the weakened decks collapse and it nearly flattens. We've already seen what a huge weight of water can do to a ship. Rogue waves have smashed superstructures in like they were made out of tin cans. On the Lusitania, the impact was so severe that a rogue wave squashed the bridge permanently back by a few inches. On the Michelangelo, the forward superstructure collapsed in entirely. On QE2, railings were bent like they were wet spaghetti. Now, that was just after a quick strike from a wave. Imagine that kind of force applied to Titanic's already weakened stern section for minutes on end as it fell. No implosion would be needed to cause this kind of damage. The destructive forces of water are already scary enough. What we're seeing is most likely the result of hydrodynamic forces at play on a structure never designed to deal with anything like that. And when you look at the damage itself, things torn off almost intact like cranes, and even whole sections of the hull, It makes a lot of sense. The water simply plucked them off, bit by bit, taking the stern apart as it dropped down. You can see the telltale signs of this in a lot of places. The poop deck torn up and folded over itself, as if being flattened down again by the stream of water surging over it. The plating here, around C deck at the ship's aft well deck, has been bent back by the force of water acting against it. Possibly even the engines themselves. At the breakup zone, 2 cylinders were ripped off, their bed plates, what they sat on, was snapped, and the columns on top were just torn away. Now, this could have happened during the breakup, sure, but given that the breakup happened further forward, at around the 3rd funnel, it's also possible the exposed engines were just ripped off by the force of water as the stern swiveled and violently pivoted around towards the sea floor. The terrible state of the stern section actually has ramifications we're still seeing today. In essence, the stern is likely to rot and collapse much sooner than the bow section because of the way corrosion works. Underwater on wrecks, typically if a ship suffers damage during the sinking, then that is where the corrosion will happen the most, and that's why the stern is probably going to collapse much sooner than the bow. It can be seen demonstrated on ships sunk in wartime. For example, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts. Where that ship suffered shell hits and splinter damage, she's corroding the most. Titanic's stern has gone through much, much more than a few shell hits. The entire thing has been beaten like a giant piñata. It means it's now collapsed down to a pathetic height, a shadow of its former glory. While the bow stands tall and proud and is eaten away from the breakup zone forward towards the very prow section, the stern is being eaten away all at once because literally everything is damaged. Soon, it will be gone almost completely. Thankfully, its state has been recorded in many ways, first by Ken's spectacular paintings, then by compelling close-up HD footage, and more recently by full 3D scans of the wreck. How long it will take for the stern section to actually collapse completely is beyond me, and to be honest with you, I'd hate to even throw an estimate out there. But for now, it tells us a story of destruction, and it gives us many clues as to the great ship's final moments. Every now and then, something comes along that upends the way we understand an historical event. Now, I'll be honest, this video is not about one of those things. We're talking about the number of blades on Titanic's central propeller, because this has been heavily debated online thanks to some very interesting evidence that emerged in the 2000s. For decades, the understanding had been that Titanic's central propeller, the one in the middle here, had 4 blades. It was an assumption made because her near-identical sister ship, the Olympic, had the same setup. But a single digit recorded in a long-lost notebook changed everything. It's an interesting little story that won't change the way we see the Titanic disaster, but it does teach us some interesting things about Edwardian engineering and daring do. So, where to begin? Well, let's talk propellers. We all kind of know what they do. They act as a kind of screw. In fact, that's why in Titanic's day they were mostly actually called screws. By angling the blades, the propeller's motion essentially acts like Archimedes' screw, an invention from around 210 BC. As if to emphasize the similarity, many early propellers were actually just giant screws that, when rotating, pulled the ship forward through the water. Propellers like this were big and clunky. Engineers had figured out in the 19th century that by adding individual blades to a central fixed hub, you could essentially emulate the motion of a screw and then eliminate the overly long and complicated body of the older style of propeller. By the time Titanic came along, the understanding of the science behind how propellers work had improved dramatically, but it still wasn't exact. Nowadays, we have complicated computer software that can help us predict how propellers will behave, but back then it was a game of trial and error, and often they didn't get things exactly right. Let's take a look at why propellers were so difficult to get right in the first place. Hydrodynamics is a complicated study. It looks closely at how bodies act underwater. Everything from the shape of the propeller to the number of its blades, their angles, all of it can drastically impact the way a ship will behave as it cuts its way through the ocean. Engineers were in a constant battle between 2 factors: efficiency and vibration. Maritime researcher Robert Reed wrote a great article about this. I'll put a link in the description below. He put it best when he said, for a given total propeller blade area, the fewer the number of blades, the more efficient the propeller. Also, for a given total propeller blade area, the more blades, the less vibration is created. When we mention propeller efficiency in this context, we're talking about the point at which the propeller's peak performance can be reached before additional factors and impacts cause it to drop off. A journal about propellers by Mercury Marine, a boat engine company, explains that technically, a single-bladed propeller would be the most efficient, but the vibration would be absolutely intolerable. The more blades you add to a propeller, efficiency begins to decrease, but so does the vibration. So the design of a ship's propeller is a big game of compromise, a battle to perfect the form and shape of the blades and then balance the number of blades so your propellers are working at their best without shaking the milk out of your passenger's tea. Sometimes, engineers got this balance wrong. Probably the most famous among shaky ships was the Lusitania. She was launched in 1906 with 4 3-bladed propellers with very wide blades. The propellers were a compromise in the designers' minds to offer the most efficiency with the least vibration. But, of course, the elements combined to create a very shaky ship indeed. Lusitania's early career was marred by intense vibration as the propellers did their thing. So much so that in 1909 she had them replaced with new, sleeker 4-bladed models. It reduced the vibration significantly and helped Lusitania reach even greater speeds. Harland and Wolff, Titanic's builders, were not out to smash the speed record with Olympic and Titanic, but they did want them to be efficient. It's evident in the ship's power plant, a hybrid setup of triple expansion steam engines and a central turbine, designed to squeeze every bit of power out of the steam that they possibly could. Now, we covered this in a video a few months ago. Suffice it to say, Titanic's designers were putting a lot of thought into how their ships would behave and how much fuel they would burn in order to maintain their demanding schedules across the Atlantic. So it was that in 1911, Olympic went into service with 2 different propeller types. Her 2 outboard screws with 3 large blades each, and a diameter 23 feet 6 inches across, or around 7.2 meters, and her single central propeller sitting inside an aperture, or a kind of cutout, in the hull. This one was driven by the central turbine, and it featured 4 blades around 16 feet 6 inches, or 5 meters across. Presumably, the design of the central propeller, with its unique 4-bladed arrangement, was chosen as it represented a solid compromise between efficiency and vibration. I wonder if Harland and Wolff looked at Cunard's issues with their turbine-powered Lusitania and her 3-bladed propellers, and decided on a 4-bladed prop out of fear of vibration. Of course, the more blades generally means the least vibration. Every photo we have of Olympic from the time shows her central prop very clearly, but believe it or not, no photo of Titanic's propellers exists. Every one of them that is often labelled as Titanic in books and documentaries is actually the Olympic. So, for decades, it was just assumed that Titanic had copied Olympic's arrangement. But, in the 2000s, a very interesting little discovery was made. In 2008, historian Mark Chirnside published an article that pointed out a tiny detail in an engineer's handbook from Harland and Wolff. It showed all the various ships on the stocks at the time, details of their propellers, the size of them, and the number of blades, and clearly marked under Titanic's central propeller is the number 3. Now, a lot of people online have a hard time dealing with this. They have an image in their minds of what Titanic looked like. Virtually every movie, painting, and model kit up to that point had shown Titanic with a 4-bladed central prop, and almost like a kind of deep-seated religious belief, many people refused to change their minds. Now, one popular argument was that it was a simple typo or a mistake, that the engineer had meant to write 4 instead of 3. But the evidence, especially the context of the time, points very much to the contrary. Remember we mentioned that Lusitania had her propellers swapped out in 1909? Well, this kind of thing was very common at the time. In the never-ending battle to balance efficiency and vibration, shipyards tested and changed their ships' propellers all the time. Olympic had gone into service with her 4-bladed central prop, and it performed extremely well. There was barely any noticeable vibration at all for the passengers. So it stands to reason that Harland and Wolff might want to try something a little different on the next sister ship to see if they could squeeze even more efficiency and power out of their design. By fitting Titanic with a 3-bladed central prop, Harland and Wolff could directly compare the 2 ships' fuel consumption, their speeds and vibration to see which design worked the best. It's not a silly concept. In fact, in 1911, they had tried this kind of arrangement on another ship, the Aberdeen Line's SS Demosthenes. The arrangement here looks strikingly similar to Olympic's, except for the addition of a 3-bladed central propeller. It's not ridiculous to think that Harland and Wolff were trying something new with Titanic, but the experiment failed because, of course, Titanic never made it to her intended destination. The real smoking gun that essentially proves Titanic was carrying a different kind of propeller is what Harland and Wolff did next. In March 1913, Olympic was fitted with her own central 3-bladed prop. Clearly, the results were poor though, because by 1920, she'd reverted to a 4-bladed type again, and her sister ship Britannic was built with the same kind. In fact, Olympic went through a handful of different blade types with propellers of all different pitches and widths. She ended up with very wide 36-foot 9-inch diameter main outboard props over her original 23-foot 6-inch models. In fact, over her career, she went through at least 4 different kinds of main outboard and 3 different kinds of central propeller. Harland and Wolff were constantly experimenting. It's a great representation of the spirit of the age, where engineers and designers tried many different methods to improve on their work. Today, Titanic's central propeller is still on the ship. It's just tantalizingly out of reach, buried under tons of seafloor silt. We'll never see it again, and no photos are known to exist. But were we to raise the ship's battered stern section, we'd most likely see a 3-bladed propeller sitting there. It's a reminder of all of the thought and work that was put into making the ship as good as she possibly could be, and it's a sad reminder of the fact that she never lived up to her full potential. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.